Welcome to And Ninthly,
an Inside Number 9 podcast.
with your host, me, David.
And me, John.
Well, hello again, John.
Hello again, David.
So, here to talk in this episode of And Ninthly about an episode of Inside Number 9 that was on just over a week ago. We've given ourselves a bit more time to think about this one, partly just due to our eccentric scheduling and the fact that it's actually an interesting little thing just before we get onto the episode itself. That this is Mr. King that was on just over a week ago on the 27th of April 2022. They've left this week-long break, haven't they? Because I think we looked it up. It was a women's football game that's on BBC Two that meant, this little gap.
Yeah, as BBC Two are frequently want to do, but as someone who spends every bank holiday weekend catching up on the snooker, which I believe we've discussed before, actually.
Yeah, it's come up, yeah.
I have no problem with that at all. So God bless you, BBC Two, for being able to provide me with both of those entertainments.
I just wanted to mention it because there's obviously all this talk when people are discussing television these days of different distribution models, which it usually comes down to the all at once Netflix model and the sort of traditional week by week one. I think I quite like the little caesura this is kind of afforded. It's like it's quite nice getting. I wouldn't like to get all of them sort of sporadically throughout the year, new Inside Number 9 episodes, but I wouldn't like to get them all at once, but I quite like getting a couple, I think, and then getting a little pause for thought,
Yeah, I think it's quite nice, actually. I think it's really good. Again, I think we discussed this before with the last series. Again, I wonder how much influence they have over this to say we would still like this to kind of go out on a broadcast schedule basis rather than just be all dumped at once, which still a lot of the BBC's sitcom content still seems to be dumped at the same time, basically. So it's interesting that they are still using the episodic format, and they're being allowed to stick to the episodic format. And again, I think it speaks to kind of the faith that the BBC have in them and have in the show itself, that it's given license to slightly bend what is now the norm in terms of how TV shows and sitcoms are delivered. So I think again, once again, it speaks to kind of the BBC's love of them and love of the show, I think.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's by accident or any sort of collaborative design, I like the little pause it's afforded me to kind of think back over these first two episodes and consider them as a duo in a sense, and there are a few connections, although obviously we don't know the broader shape of the series yet. Before we get into the specifics of Mr. King, which I think there's a ton of lot to talk about here, I've been really looking forward to unpacking it with you. I want to mention, so I went back before we started recording these podcasts and listened to the way we treated Series 6 on the podcast and on the Scapegoat podcast, which I'll link to here again. When only a couple of episodes of that had been on, when we were discussing, I think it was Wuthering Heist and Simon Says, I remember we were talking about whether a sort of, not theme exactly, but whether a sort of feel or preoccupation of the show was sort of emerging, whether on purpose or by accident. And back then, a year ago, we were talking about the fact that they seem to be in a very meta mood. They seem to be very, almost like Inside Number 9 about Inside Number 9 and about the reaction to Inside Number 9 and about fandom and all that kind of stuff. Remember we were talking about that? So, in a similar way, I was wondering if based on just these first two of Series 7, there's something in the air or in their heads at the moment about rethinking and recontextualising and re-examining the memory of being the League of Gentlemen. Thoughts?
Oh, interesting. I think I'll leave you to expand on that first. As you know, I'm not as much of a league aficionado as yourself. I think I see where you're going with that kind of gothic folk horror element to it that League has writ large, perhaps. Is that your sense at this stage?
Yeah, well, it's meant to tease out threads more than anything else, because I know these are the accidents of sort of scheduling and which episodes came together in which series and all that sort of thing. But I think it was starting off the series with the Gatiss stuff, last episode, and with quite I think we noted at the time, an unusual amount of sort of bawdy humour and stuff like that. And then in this episode, very much going into what could be a very League of Gentlemen-esque sort of sitcom setting, and having quite a lot of that kind of humour in it. And then very much revisiting we're sort of getting into the lead here, but like very much getting into the folk horror stuff. And the League of Gentlemen not only touched on, well, let's face it, the Wicker Man. I wondered how long it was going to be before any of us said that. But also
surprisingly long.
Yeah, but also, do you remember the League that you had the children of the Dentons, Chloe and Radcliffe, the horrific little Shining type girls?
Yeah.
And I've got loads to say on this podcast about the idea of like horrific children and stuff. I think that's a really interesting thing they tap into here. But what was your, I guess before we get into many more of the specifics, what was your overall reaction to Mr. King? Did you have a good time?
I did have a good time. Surprisingly, I had a good time. It's another one of those that obviously spoilers everybody. That there's a significant twist that I think comes around the 20-minute mark that kind of derails everything or reveals everything and takes it in a very different direction. I was a little bit unsure to begin with. I'm not particularly squeamish or overly sensitive, but I find that child abuse, the theme of child abuse generally being used in comedy programs, I think happens far too frequently, and happens as a bit of a kind of lazy shock tactic. So I was initially quite nervous because particularly with the scenes with him kind of keeping Kerry behind, they were definitely giving us an air of threat from him, from the Reece Shearsmith character, Alan, I believe it is. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought it was Alan.
Yes, exactly.
It's a very good joke. So I was a little bit wary, I think, of where they were going to go with this, but obviously, we're in very safe hands, and I think the reason I love the show so much is that their sensibilities match their viewers' sensibilities to an extent. And that I needn't particularly have worried about that. And obviously the children, as it turns out, are creepy, the aggressors in this scenario, the aggressors rather than the victims. So I enjoyed that very much. That kind of reveal of that, I think that kind of relieved me as much as anything else. And I'm a big fan of the Wicker Man. So I think I messaged you afterwards saying, right, well, we can tick the Wicker Man off the list now then. I'm surprised it's taken them this many series to do anything vaguely along the lines of the Wicker Man. Just before we get into the Wicker Man, I wanted to pick up on that thing you were saying about the sort of the tone and the sort of suspicion of child abuse things, because that was actually, I was feeling a bit of that as well, and I don't know if it's sort of similar queasiness as to the topic or just the kind of way they were handling it whilst doing the quite broad humour interjections and stuff at the same time. But it was making me think of they were trying to do like a kind of that film Doubt, the Meryl Streep movie, that so like a serious drama like that, but with kind of almost Carry On-esque humour in it as well. And I was kind of like, this might be I don't, maybe it's just me being squeamish about the ultimate taboo, I guess, but like I was kind of like, maybe this is a tonal interchange too far for them, even though they've navigated a lot of those before. Yeah, do you know what? On the second watch of it, actually, I think what it revealed to me is that actually this is what they do incredibly well. We've talked before about, what is it that they're making here exactly? Are they, is this a comedy show? Is this gothic drama? Is it, it is still meant to be a comedy. I mean, that's the slot they're in, that's the genre they're in, that's essentially how it's pitched and where they come from. And actually it struck me that in this episode, when on a rewatch, a lot of these lines they are really broadly comic, but they are also very, very good lines. There's a lot of very good, fairly standard joke setups and punchlines, basically, that, be they misunderstandings about, what neeps are, or
Yeah.
you know, be it the Alamadam joke, which is very good. A lot of it is to do with kind of misunderstandings, but they're very good jokes, and it's almost like they've kind of gone out of their way to have like some really solid punchlines in there all the way through to keep it rolling. You know, when I don't know if you compare it to a lot of other episodes we've talked about before, that don't seem to actually have any actual jokes in them, because that's not what they're trying to do. So I think actually this was very comedically written, and I think the tone is handled very skillfully, and I think this is what they do very well. Is, you know, stick a different soundtrack on it, and you've got a broadly based sitcom. Maybe even stick a laugh track on it as well, and you've got something, like you say, a bit more carry on. But because they can do that, they can have their cake and eat it. They can have those comic lines and punchlines, but yet they can have this absolute sense of threat going on all the way from the very, very beginning, and a lot of that's in the music and the direction. So actually, I see what you mean about on the first watch whether tonally it was right, but on my second watch, I actually I think I enjoyed the script much more, and I enjoyed kind of seeing how they were weaving those two tones together.
Yeah, well, I was tying it directly back to their League work, but you know, it's funny you talk about the sort of often broad comedic tone of it, and I was thinking, right, so from a metropolitan perspective, and we'll definitely get back to that, some of this sort of like broad regional aren't regional people odd comedy reminded me of nothing other than Little Britain, particularly, you know, Steve Pemberton's headmaster figure and stuff. I could imagine that being a recurring Little Britain sketch, you know.
Yeah, that's an interesting point actually,
because a lot of Little Britain was like pick a region and basically put an eccentric in it, you know.
Yeah, there is a bit of that, but I think whatever of that there is in it disappears quite quickly once the actual premise is fleshed out and presents itself. Yes, the episode opens with them talking Welsh, you know, with the headmaster discussing how Alan is going to be teaching them in English, and that's extraordinary, and there's lots of mentions of what a small village they are and how they don't have Wi-Fi, and you know, a very good joke about spending all weekend downloading one episode of Country File. So yeah, that's there. I mean, I'm not sure how I would feel about it if I was in fact from Pontypridd, but I might feel differently perhaps, but
well, you do have license to talk as someone originally from the Celtic fringe, so please do use that license.
The license to the Celtic fringe.
License to Celt.
License to Celt. Well, obviously, as you know as well, obviously growing up in the southwest and then going to university in Wales, actually, I feel as much of a kinship with the Welsh, I guess. As anyone, it's always like it's always slightly lovely just to hear like the Welsh language on mainstream TV. Really,
the episode starts with you hearing Welsh being spoken from outside the classroom, doesn't it?
Yeah, so we're outside the classroom, and the headmaster is inside, kind of introducing the new teacher to the class, and he's introducing him. It's, you know, it's basic stuff. It's all, you know, Borodar, good morning, welcome, croeso. You could argue, I guess, that there is a danger that you're pointing and laughing in a way and saying, well, these people are really, really insular, and obviously the easiest hook to hang that on is, let's say, the Welsh. Let's say a small Welsh village. Where can we imagine this sort of thing actually taking place? Because essentially we're looking at, you know, a slightly backward looking, not modernised, not advanced village society, aren't we? Essentially,
Yeah,
it's in the same way that we are with the Wicker Man.
Well,
So
I was going to say,
guess,
do you think it's just too obvious for them to do Scotland? I think that might be a big part
yeah,
of it.
I think so. Yeah, I absolutely think so. I think you can't, and I guess Welsh is as good a place as any. I didn't feel like there was any mockery in the episode. I didn't feel like there was actually any pointing and laughing at them. That Alan certainly doesn't make any jokes at their expense, I don't think. I think the jokes that are there are, kind of the behaviour of the cleaner and the behaviour of the headmaster, perhaps have an air of, this is kind of normalised behaviour in this village, but I don't think there's any malevolence in there. I think it's all there to serve the story.
Well, I think you tread an interesting line. I've got so much to say about the kids. I'm going to put that on most of the back end of the show, I think. But I think you tread that interesting line when as this episode turns out, you're exploring that line between seeming naivety and yokeldom, I suppose you might call it old-fashionedly, and when that becomes sinister. Because I was thinking about that in the fairly early scene when Alan is seeing what reference points in terms of environmentalism they know. And it starts, I'd say, and again, this is from a metropolitan perspective, it passes the point where you're laughing at the kids for not knowing these popular reference points like Greta Thunberg and then climate change, to the point where they say haven't heard the phrase global warming, which arguably came in the 90s and things like that, and that's getting to the point where it's turning funny backwards local stuff into, this is a bit weird, this isn't just odd. This isn't just odd. It's a bit unsettling that they haven't heard of this stuff, So that's a good that's a good way to tiptoe into these waters, I think.
Yeah, and then later in the episode, it goes full on down the line of they've never heard of Michael Jackson. So I think it's all about the insularity of that village, and how little they know of the outside world. That doesn't necessarily have to be given a regional bias, I guess, but for ease of plot, for ease of writing, I just think for ease of writing your way into it, I think it's kind of expedient for it to be a small, insulated village in order for it to make sense as well. And there are other little references, to the headmaster saying that the school's nearly been shut down a couple of times, and take that Ofsted. They're obviously not so insulated that there isn't some input from the outside world. But you also have to ask yourself, once you get to the end, you also have, you want to ask yourself, well, how have they been getting away with this for so long? Yeah. This is not something you can get away with. So again, I think as a logical kind of narrative technique, it makes sense for it to be a very insular, backward-looking kind of a place. Which Wales definitely is not, ladies and gentlemen. No, definitely is not.
Legally have to say that. It's funny, I said today I was going to read the Stephen King short story, The Children of the Corn, on my lunch break. Mm-hmm. I did, and it's quite a different story. Interesting that I was looking into it. That Children of the Corn was written in the mid-70s, published in 77, which is 5 years after The Wicker Man came out. And, you can tie that in with, a bunch of folk horror happening in the 70s and also a bunch of child-fearing horror. The Omen's probably a pretty interesting one to mention there. But I was rereading the short story Children of the Corn, which got turned into the movie. There's actually an amusing bit in the story where the main protagonist is in this abandoned town in Nebraska that's meant to be surrounded by hundreds of square miles of corn and isolated, but basically on a road, I think he says 20 miles away from the nearest other village and stuff. So, and there's actually a whole paragraph where he's going, but surely this cult couldn't have grown up and been unexamined. Surely the state police would come by from time to time. And how could it be that? And he basically, the whole character just goes through how impossible this premise is, really. And then he just sweeps it aside because he's actually being chased by demonic children, And it's it's Stephen King, I think, having a bit of fun with all the reasons why it doesn't really make much sense, And,
yeah.
I thought of that in this as well. I wanted to just give a quick shout out to Annette Badland, who is the lady who plays the cleaner in this episode, because it's interesting to talk about the Welsh regional stuff. She's been in tons of stuff, obviously, but I mainly know her as the disguised Slitheen lady in the Christopher Eccleston series of Doctor Who, where she's particularly tied into being like a sort of an alien, but like posing as like a sort of corrupt Welsh bureaucrat, basically.
Of course she is.
Yeah.
Of course she is. Yes, very very good. And what are we, about 20 minutes in? First Doctor Who mention.
I've got some Star Trek ones coming up. Don't worry.
Hey! I don't think it counts if I force you to say it. I was just going to ask you about Children of the Corn, actually, because it's not something that I'm particularly familiar with. I've never read it or seen it. So what crossover is there with Children of the Corn and this episode?
Well, I would say that actually gets me right to the Star Trek references, right? Because I was trying to think of parallels to this that aren't the Wicker Man. Because I know we keep skirting the Wicker Man. We will get a bit more directly onto that. But like, I think so. Children of the Corn is about a cult of religious extremist children who essentially take over for over a decade this isolated Nebraska town and kill all the adults. That's the premise. And then this quote unquote normal couple stumble across the village, like a decade into this sort of like Taliban-esque regime that these kids have set up. And there's also some supernatural elements where they're worshipping something in the corn that you don't get a full glimpse of and all that sort of stuff. But I was just thinking that the difference, and there's a few Star Trek episodes of the original series where they come across planets where children have taken over in various ways, either aided or by a virus mutation or a supernatural being and all that sort of stuff. I was thinking where they differ is they are about establishing monstrous cults or societies of children, of only children, which is obviously a whole upheaval of the order that grown-ups are used to, and there's a reason why that's horrific and threatening. This is more in keeping with the Wicker Man, isn't it? In that, although we focus on the kids and they do great stuff with the performance of the kids and the way in which kids act and everything, this is still an order, isn't it? This is an alternative order, but still administered and taught and maintained by grown-ups. It's not a complete upheaval.
Yeah, it's adult down, isn't it? It's cyclical, because you can imagine that these children then grow up to be adults who teach children these values as well. So it's a perpetual cycle, much like birth and returning to the earth, birth and death, and being returned to the ground, etc. In that way, if we want to take it to that extreme, that's interesting. The crossover with the Stephen King story as well, though. I was thinking of. Do you remember The Children of Green No?
I've heard of that, but I've never seen it.
Scrabbling in my head now. So there is a bit there. The Children of Green No, I think, is a little bit more wholesome, but it is to do with spirits and supernatural entities that kind of inhabit a kind of Huntingdonshire manor, basically. So there is a kind of supernatural element to that, although it doesn't seem to be quite as murderous by the sounds of it. But also, so they're actually older than I thought as well. The books were actually in the 1950s, which is a lot older than I thought. I seem to remember it's because the TV shows were in the mid-80s, basically, that they were made, which is why I associate them with the 80s. But actually, it's they're 1950s books. Julian Fellows wrote and directed a film adaptation in 2009. Interestingly,
I'd watch that over Downton.
I'd watch almost anything over Downton, to be perfectly honest with you. I'd watch insects. That's it. I'd watch insects.
Yeah. One thing I was going to mention about the kids, leading the aggression at the end of this episode, but still being within an adult order. I was thinking one way in which they keep the cast relatively contained in classic Inside Number 9 fashion and don't bring too much in to shatter that kids leading the way kind of mood they want to create is actually, it was only on the rewatch I was like, how clever the superglue is in that respect, because I was thinking back to the Wicker Man, where you do actually need a mob of townsfolk, and like including like several burly men, to subdue Edward Woodward and capture him and put him in the, threaten him and ultimately put him in the Wicker Man for sacrifice. Whereas in this, the superglue is just such a neat sidestep to, without even knowing it, he's in the trap, and then the kids can run amok, and you only need to bring in Steve Pemberton, and then at the very end Annette Badland as the adults who will, the kids don't need brute force basically, and they don't need to mob him. They don't need to attack him with knives or clubs or anything, to subdue him in that way. They can just be sinister kids, and he's already defeated.
Yeah, it's very good as well. It's very clever in the way that at the start of their assembly performance, they're referring to "We've glued ourselves to." I think number 10 Downing Street there, and they've got a big kind of prop of super glue, so they're bringing that in as kind of thematically present within it, and obviously that does tie you properly back to Extinction Rebellion and to pre-pandemic, wasn't it? Was it around 2019 when they were shutting down a lot of central London by...
Yeah, that was the large scale, the Waterloo Bridge shut down.
Yeah, gluing themselves to public buildings. So actually that's a very, very clever conceit to tie it into kind of slightly more modern ecological concerns.
There's the bit where Kerry. They use this cleverly several times in the show, but where they use, like, I think in most cases genuine child actor outtakes to Kerry has misheard Extinction Rebellion as the Stinking Rebellion.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a quick thing then about, because we were talking about Alan as a protagonist, and we talk about him as a metropolitan figure coming into this zone. Again, I said on this podcast I wasn't just going to repeat too many things that I'd heard on the Inside Number 9 podcast, but a really interesting tidbit was that apparently they were thinking of making him Tom, the character Tom from the season 1 episode Tom and Jerry, because they were thinking that he's a teacher who's having a mental health crisis, essentially. Without going into the specifics of that episode, that's his basic background, and he's in London. He's based in London, and dark and disturbing things happen to him and around him. And they were thinking we could make this, and they almost did. Apparently, it was a kind of a late rewrite thing that they didn't. That we could make this our first sort of sequel, and talk about out of the frying pan into the fryer, like if they'd done that, But
yeah, that's very interesting, and I wonder what their conversations and other people involved in the conversations was kind of for and against that, because that would be the first time that we've seen a returning character from another episode, I think. Would it not? So aside from, I mean, it doesn't really count that, like, kind of the second episode is kind of replayed in the Ghost in the Machine episode, so that doesn't really count, but would be the first time that the fictional world has allowed for a returning character. Yeah, that's quite interesting. That wouldn't have occurred to me at all. I did, particularly on the rewatch, I was very aware of kind of the early threat that's kind of given to Alan. There is some suspicion when he keeps Kerry behind, and you see him take some pills.
Yeah, and he loses his temper noticeably, doesn't he?
Yes.
More so than an average teacher would.
Yeah, he does, and then downs a couple of pills, and there's obviously something going on in there, and we're kind of led to believe that maybe he is the malevolent character that's going to turn on us at some point. He's the red herring, essentially. So it's interesting that they would have gone down that route and made him Tom from Tom and Jerry. I'm kind of glad they didn't, to be honest. I don't really want them to bring characters back in. I like them to remain standalone. I like all of these.
Yeah, on balance, it's a virtue of the show, I think.
Yeah, I think it is a virtue of the show. Although obviously they'll probably do that one day, and I'll say how brilliant it is. So
yeah, of course, we reserve the right to change our minds.
And then I'll ask you to edit this out. So that'll be fun.
The privilege of the Celt.
The Celtic fringe. Can you see my Celtic fringe?
Yes, I can at the moment. Yeah, the audience can't. I wanted to bring another old episode up, actually, and it's not too old. In fact, it may have been written alongside this episode, because, as mentioned previously on the show, this is season 6 and 7 of the show have ended up in a big old jumble of things written pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, etc. And I think they say on the Inside Number 9 one that this was written quite a long time ago, so presumably originally for Series 6. So it may have been written alongside Last Night of the Proms. And I was thinking that Shearsmith's character has some interesting parallels in this to his character in Last Night at the Proms. Do you remember where he was kind of, to simplify things a little bit, he was the sort of repressed, angry Remainer. They were kind of poking fun at a certain kind of urban liberal sensibility that they could be expected to largely share in, at least, from what you might assume of Pemberton and Shearsmith. And I think there's a bit of that turned more towards environmentalism in this, isn't there? There's the idea that he is this flawed figure who has the beliefs and prejudices in a neutral way and kind of ideals, I suppose, that the assumed audience of Inside Number 9 might largely share. But he is also shown to be a troubled individual. He's shown to be a short-tempered individual. He's shown to be a slightly overzealous individual in the way he's teaching the. I mean, I haven't seen the range of behaviours in which environmentalism is taught to primary school children, but there's a sense that he's maybe they're poking fun at metropolitan people who are, from the best will in the world, are a bit too into environmentalism as a hobby horse. You know what I mean?
Yes, I think I do, but I'm not sure what I think.
I should maybe qualify that slightly by saying people who are into environmentalism to the extent of actually intimidating children. You know what I mean? Because they play around with that line, don't they? And I know it's complicated because this is tied up with Kerry's play acting in the in the aim of the eventual ending. But
yeah, I mean, in the way that he is. When he loses his temper, it's because he's saying, this is the single most important thing that is going to affect you. And it's very hard to disagree with that. It's very hard to disagree with, telling a room full of primary school age children that, the environmental issues are the ones that are obviously going to affect them the most. In their lifetimes, more than it will affect you or I or adults in their lifetimes. Although there will be an effect, obviously, each generation is exponentially going to be affected more and more and more by these environmental issues.
Yeah.
Whether that's kind of preaching to the choir slightly in terms of who their audience are, who their audience often are. I'm not sure.
Well, but I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think they're problematising that interestingly, and I think what it reminded me of was things like, when slightly more right-leaning critics of kind of critical race theory and things like that, when they push back on the idea of teaching, say, to sort of simplify, it's like white privilege. And one of the arguments I've seen there is that it will upset children, that it will give, let's say, white children a sense of guilt that is not constructive, that is not helpful, that is not a thing that you should pass on to children. And it was reminding me of that applied to environmentalism. Instead, it was reminding me of that where you're at least playing around with the idea that he's got an almost unwholesome zeal about making these kids worried about something that they seem, at least at the start, ignorant about,
Yeah, I guess so.
I'm not equating the two things, by the way. I'm not equating
no.
the two themes there, but the way in which they're seen sometimes.
Sure. I wonder, again, it's always interesting to kind of think about how the episodes are constructed and how they're written, and to think about, what comes first. I mean, if the idea that comes to you first is, let's do something around the John Barleycorn / Wicker Man / pagan sacrifice to Mother Earth. If that's the first idea that you have, and that's the springboard that you're working from, then actually to then pull in the environmental stuff just looks beautiful and kind of neat and really gives you a leg up to the writing, I think, and to say, well, we can write something like that and make it absolutely relevant and make it absolutely chime with what's going on today with modern audiences, which is not always something they're particularly bothered about doing. In fact, I'd say they're rarely bothered about doing something that feels very, very contemporary. Again, you can talk about Last Night at the Proms and how that has very modern aesthetics and themes, but I don't know. Off the top of my head, I'd say it's somewhere around 20 odd % that is actually kind of relating to a real world that I live in, that I recognise that has the same largely concerns as me.
Yeah.
So I wonder which way round it comes, or if they did think, well, we want to touch on environmental issues. We're finding this, all of the environmentalism and Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg all very interesting. And then yes-anding that, I guess, to the conclusion, or maybe it's a massing of their influences. Obviously, being again, we're going to mention the Wicker Man, obviously, because it's kind of writ large there, and just running with that and seeing where it takes them. And I think if you write that in, well, it turns out they didn't write it in 2022. They wrote it in, if it was for season 6, then they wrote it in 2019, maybe.
I suppose so. 2019, yeah, I would imagine.
And how you could not touch on those themes in 2019, as we've just said, that was around the time that Extinction Rebellion were shutting down central London quite frequently.
Just before we leave this bit, because I do want to talk to you about the Wicker Man next, but how about right at the end, the sort of final shot, I believe, of the school children's classroom wall, when one of the things they zero in on is the poster that Alan earlier has put up, which is the Greta Thunberg picture that's done up to look like the Obama Hope poster, with this, in this context, with the sinister music playing over it and with you knowing what's going on outside. That's a very powerful, a very strange final image, isn't it? And I was thinking particularly, we were talking before about the sort of the anxiety of demon children of the 70s, whatever that was denoting in the wake of, the 60s counterculture and all that sort of stuff. Greta Thunberg is very much to right-wing anti-environmentalists, because of course you do get right-wing pro-environmentalists, but to right-wing anti-environmentalists, Greta Thunberg is very much a demon child, isn't she? She's very much someone who's possessed by cult-like ideas and who is either off her own bat or by the manipulation of adults leading people astray. That is a right-wing conception of Greta Thunberg, and I thought that was interesting to mix her up with this sort of iconic Hope poster, and especially given what's going on outside.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I'd not thought about it in that way. Of I'm not going to quote you out of context of Greta Thunberg being a demon child.
Well, I know she listens to this podcast, so I don't get things wrong.
Does. Love your work, Greta. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. That to a lot of people, she will be seen as
misguided at best, I suppose.
Yeah, as doing something like wrong or malevolent or certainly wrong-headed. The change poster, I just feel like after, the first Obama change posters were so long ago and were so endlessly memed and replicated that I almost don't see the Obama reference there anymore at all. So I kind of feel like that has just become a way of visually presenting someone important with hope, progressive idea. Yeah.
So is this fixed to one particular area? Is like adding "gate" as a suffix is now? Do you think?
Well, we shall see. It does appear that affixing the suffix "gate" is not going to go away anytime soon.
It's not. So I know you said you were hoping to find time to rewatch The Wicker Man.
I didn't do that.
How long is it since you've seen it? Roughly?
It's been a couple of years. Couple of years. The last time I saw it, I had a kind of folk horror viewing day with some friends of mine, which included Midsummer and Whistle and I'll Come to You.
Right.
But I've seen it a lot. I've watched that film quite a lot. I used to watch
as have Pemberton and Shearsmith, obviously.
Yeah, one would imagine.
It's interesting because I rewatched it just purely coincidence, not knowing Mr. King was coming out, not knowing there was going to be any connection at all. I watched it probably about 4 weeks ago. I saw Mr. King only a week ago, so it was very fresh in the mind. And without knowing where they were going exactly, early in the episode, I started to be reminded of the scenes, as you were saying, with Edward Woodward in the schoolhouse, just because those just stuck in my head, where he's interrogating the school children about the missing Rowan Morrison, and like that we finds the beetle crawling around the nail and things like that. But just something about the tone of him trying to get some sort of meaning and answers about this missing teacher out of the children was I think it was resonating to me Wicker Man vibes before it became in the least apparent that that's where they were going with it.
Interesting. And it's just occurred to me as well how important it is that Edward Woodward is a virgin in The Wicker Man, and how important Alan's penis actually becomes.
The sheathing.
It is important, what his penis looks like. So there is that element of there needs to be a certain sexual criteria fulfilled. Yeah. So that's an interesting parallel that's only just occurred to me. Yeah, I don't think the Wicker Man, really came to mind until it was kind of thrust in my face, in the last 10 minutes, basically. So I think up until then it was, for me, it was quite concealed. But, as I say, it's been a couple of years since I watched it.
Well, it was... It's interesting. So I think it's really interesting the episode's called Mr. King. I think the fact that they name it, and it's a really clever twist that, although, because I think towards the start, the moment they read out that postcard, I think in the very first scene, the girl reads out the postcard from the old Mr. King, and he says something like "Greetings from Down Under." Straight away, I was like, "Oh, he's almost like the too obvious thing to think about is that he's dead, right? That's the original Mr. King is dead." Yeah. And I like that in a way that is a bit too obvious, but they just let it lie there. And the twist isn't really that he's not, because he is probably dead. That's the heavy implication that that old Mr. King did die.
He definitely did. He definitely did, because he was Mr. Oh, I forget what his actual name is. He's Mr. Henry or something, isn't he?
Oh, I remember this because they put it out the podcast, Mr. Hardy, and they're making a nod to the Wicker Man director.
Oh, of course, it's Mr. Hardy. Yeah. For God's sake, how did I not spot that?
Yeah, no, I didn't spot it first viewing either. But but I just what I mean is I just like the cleverness of the twist isn't who Mr. King is or was or what happened to him really, although that's linked. It's what does Mr. King mean? I like that. I like that as a twist. They've got you asking the wrong question in a sense.
They have. It's very good misdirection, because particularly when Alan is sort of having his first doubts about how the children have been taught up to this stage, and again kind of the spectre of potential abuse is kind of looming over that. I would say, in terms of why has this teacher gone away? Why are they not familiar with some very basic Key Stage 2 concepts, and why is one of them boiling tadpoles and seems weirdly she's got this, she's got the look in her eye every time kind of he's mentioned, hasn't she, that she looks kind of damaged by the mention of his name. So that is definitely misdirection, because obviously you're thinking Mr. King has gone. Was Mr. King malevolent? Was there something wrong about Mr. King? Did he do something wrong? And yeah, you're absolutely right. That's the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask should be, has Mr. King been ritually sacrificed by the children and then buried in the fields? Obviously, that's the question we should all have instantly been asking ourselves.
I haven't been able to get the John Barleycorn song out of my head for the last week, which has been another effect of it sort of percolating for a week and having that time to think about it. I wanted to bring up one sort of line or exchange in particular. This is after Alan's had his lips glued tight and he's being talked to by Steve Pemberton's character. Because I think it ties together a lot of what we talk about the sort of folk horror, about the rural, metropolitan versus rural stuff, about the politics sort of underlying this, because I think there is a strong strain of politics kind of, you might say in the same way, maybe better than they did in Last Night at the Proms, which I remember I liked more than you, but they're maybe doing a similar thing here that maybe we can both jive with better, where they're tying contemporary politics into a much more symbolic kind of poetic reading of what they do. I really like the line where, I should have noted it down verbatim, but like Pemberton says something like, you metropolitan folks like to think, all about recycling and all about the environment, but we've been looking after this for hundreds of years. And I was like,
yeah, we've been doing this for centuries.
Yeah, it's interesting because you are tying, because obviously all that's sort of in the Wicker Man with the sort of folk renewal of the seasons and the harvest and everything, and that's what this is. But just the way he repurposes it as a one-upmanship thing of like, you don't know what you're talking about. We know much better than you city types. Which is not exactly the way, say, Christopher Lee phrases it, or it's not the point Christopher Lee is making as Lord Summersisle. I thought that was really interesting, and that kind of, there's a little clever heart of it there. I think where and this again is where the people who are looked down upon, the regions that look down upon in British society, the demographics that look down upon, are at least able sometimes to turn the tables and flip those perceptions around, even if it's violently, and this, I just like everything they were playing with there. I was catnip to me, basically.
I do agree with you. It's a great moment. It's a great line where he says, we've been looking after the earth for centuries. But you can't ignore the side of that argument that is what they've been doing is ritually slaughtering human beings and burying them in the fields.
Yeah, to no rational end.
Which does slightly undercut any kind of moral high ground that they have to suggest that they've been looking after the earth better than the Metropolitan Elite.
Well, I don't. To be clear, I don't think the people in the Wicker Man are doing the right thing either. I think.
Oh well, hang on.
Just had to put that on the record.
Hang on. You've gone too far now.
I guess what I mean is like, so obviously the Wicker Man makes great. For anyone who's not seen it, with thoroughly spoiling the Wicker Man as well, makes great hay out of the religions put against. Yes, religions put against other religions, right? Like the people of fervent faith with different faiths who believe in different sorts of gods and different sorts of cosmologies, coming to blows. And I think in this you might say the faith is environmentalism. They're both fervent believers. Alan is a fervent environmentalist, and he's coming face to face with other fervent environmentalists who just look at it very differently from him.
Yeah, quite possibly. I'm not sure if I would put it in quite as strong terms. In that, is it all about environmentalism? Is the whole thing about environmentalism?
Well, let me qualify that slightly more.
I guess it could be.
They're giving Alan, a seemingly secular character, a secular sort of faith to bring into that environment, like
sure.
to be a bit like what Edward Woodward brings into that story, I suppose.
Sure.
Arguably. listeners back me up.
No, I'll buy that. I'll buy that. That's absolutely fine. I just think I saw this episode as more of an interesting way of. I think what I was saying earlier about my suspicion is that the writing started with, let's do something like The Wicker Man and let's use John Barleycorn and the whole idea of, human beings being returned to the earth, and then going, we can tie in modern day environmentalism to it, I guess. I don't see that as being the premise of the episode. I see that as being a result of the premise of the episode, if that makes sense. Which is why I think I don't disagree with you, but I certainly hadn't thought about it in terms of their environmentalism being their thing, being their secular religion, if you like.
Well, let's look at this from another angle, maybe. Would you say this is one of the best sort of I would say straight horror, because no episode of Inside Number 9 is just one thing, really. But in terms of the climax, let's say, is this one of the best horror moments they've done in Inside Number 9? Because I think it's right up there. I'm thinking of things like, we've discussed before, like The Harrowing and Seance Time, and I absolutely love The Devil of Christmas, which is a different sort of horror. But I know we talked at length about the Halloween special. Do you think this is up there with the best, at least in that subgenre of Inside Number 9?
Yes, I think it is, but I think it really perhaps speaks to kind of their confidence and how long they've been doing this now, of how little they actually need to show. The last thing that we see is really, is from his perspective, from underneath that mask, and that's kind of it. We know what's going to happen. We've seen the Thresher. but that's it. That's as far as it's going to go. Aside from, I mean, it's quite grisly watching his lips being stuck together, and obviously his arms being super glued to a chair isn't much fun either. I guess what I'm saying is when you compare it to something like The Harrowing, which is proper, gory scare, and The Devil of Christmas as well, I would say has a real this is possibly even turn away from the screen time, whereas I don't think this ever has that level of threat. I think it underplays it quite well, and I wonder if that is a result of having children involved as well, of having the very issues with broadcasting it and filming it and making it, etc., that you do not see the children involved in any act of violence, and I suspect that's also crucial as well.
That might be part of it, yeah.
So yes, it's obviously psychologically quite terrifying, but I don't know. It didn't make me want to turn away. I didn't feel gut punched by it. I think largely as well because strangely, obviously because we're watching them now with a kind of view to talking about them. It's like I say, it's like, oh, Wicker Man, right, lovely, okay.
Yeah. What do you feel is the glee of the notes you're about to take?
Yeah, pretty much. Which is perhaps not the right way to enjoy it, but there it is.
Well, I think so. Here's something that, in my opinion, may revise on this, but as we have had a week to think about it. But I mean, partly the imagery of him wearing the John Barleycorn mask, and I agree, it's not very explicit, but I think especially when you look up the song afterwards, or if you know anything about the song and the sort of processes it describes and stuff, the implications of what's going to happen to him are often more horrific than actually seeing things happen.
Yeah.
But just the shot of Annette Badland coming into the room in that sort of effigy with the baby's head and the long stick-like arms. I mean, and she comes in quite slowly as well, so she's almost sort of floating. That in itself, I mean, that could have. They didn't milk that, but that could have gone on for a bit longer, and I would have liked to. That really did a number on me. But I was thinking, and actually, okay, so let me preface this slightly. I do have some issues with this episode. Some of that tonal stuff we talked about at the start, some of the, I think, overuse of body humour and stuff like that, and some of the stuff around the child abuse suspicions, like we were talking about. I think not all of it gels. I think when you see the ending, it works, but I think the ending alone. And actually, I might feel this way. This might make me feel more about it the way I do about The Harrowing, actually, which is an episode with similar mixed tones and similar League-type callbacks and stuff. The sheer impact of this as an ending, it's been a while for me feeling like that about Inside Number 9. And I think I don't think this would be one of my, if we were to redo our sort of top 9 lists or whatever, I don't think this would quite be on it. But it's probably a close thing, and it is mostly the strength of the ending for me. And I think I don't think I really felt this strongly about any of the episodes in Series 6. Put it that way.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm gonna digest that. I'm not sure I'm gonna make a similar statement at this stage. But yes, I'd see what you're saying. So this has impacted you more than anything from the previous series has.
Yeah. Been thinking about it a lot more, and I think I'm considering where it ranks in the pantheon in a way I wasn't really for those episodes. Well, all right, here's a very basic question because we'll wrap up soon. But we've only seen 2 episodes this series. Did you like it? And I'm not going to get you to do number rankings or anything, but did you like it better than Merrily Merrily?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know that I can compare them. I think I enjoyed them both. I kind of want to say equally. Actually, I'd say if anything, Merrily Merrily might edge it for me because I think the ending of Merrily Merrily was great, and also I think it was so stylish, and obviously, there's the element of having Mark Gatiss in it, and it, obviously it's a very, very different thing, but I think I actually, perhaps it appeals to me more when they do that kind of proper human emotional punch stuff. So
yeah, they're two different. They're two different strengths, you know. I mean,
they are two different strengths, and I think you can perhaps divide them into the kind of real world emotional trauma or situation, and something kind of folky, gothic, supernatural, etc. Which weirdly, Merrily Merrily does both. Merrily Merrily absolutely has its cake and eats it in that respect, whereas this one, you know, it has allusions to his mental health issues, but it's, you know, we're never really given a chance to empathise with him in any particular way. He's just going through this, and we're not that interested in his backstory. That's a long-winded, rambling way of me covering over thinking about it, and I'm going to say I think Merrily Merrily edges it for me at this stage. If you put a scythe to my head and forced me to choose, if you caged me in a massive effigy made of, let's say, wicker.
Well, try lifting your arms.
Oh no! Oh Jesus Christ! No!
Summertime is coming.
Christ!
So that's interesting. We won't make full lists, obviously, till the end of this series, but it's actually we might diverge already on those preferences. So John, is there anything else you'd like to bring up? Because I think I'm at the end of everything I wanted to talk about there. Really, any final points?
I had a mad idea that at some point I want to do an analysis of Inside Number 9 using only the wigs that Pemberton and Shearsmith wear, and whether there's some kind of format to the malevolence of their character based on the wig they're wearing. There was something about Reece Shearsmith's wig in this that kind of fascinated me, that it was sort of like, it doesn't quite look like a normal haircut, but it doesn't look unlike, there's something about like the shagginess at the back, and I'm like, I'm sure I've seen you wearing a wig like this before, and I can't quite pin. And we've now got, you know, however many episodes of Inside Number 9 we have there, you know, they are dressing up in pretty much every single one of them, aren't they? And but some of those looks are recurring. I'm now obviously instantly going to go back and look at pictures of Tom from Tom and Jerry and see how closely that relates to it.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Wig of the week.
Wig of the week
will be introduced next time. I just realised you were talking about Shearsmith's look there. I've just realised really obvious point we didn't make in terms of tying the first episodes together. He's died at the end of both of them.
That's true. Yeah.
Shearsmith's been on the rack both times.
Yeah, he's crossed the sticks, and he's been returned to the soil.
Yeah, we'll see how he gets on next time. But yeah, so me and John will be back. We're not sure that scheduling for this has been mad because we weren't expecting it to come back this soon, and then they've taken this week break, but we'll come back.
I preferred it when you called our scheduling eccentric.
Eccentric,
much more.
That's much more modern vernacular. But we'll be back when we're back, and we'll definitely see out the rest of the series, and we'll see you again next time. Say bye-bye, John.
Bye-bye, John.
Classic. Never gets old. And bye-bye, everyone.
Oh, no.
Have you been to the fields? Something there made me afraid, like dying younger if the ground never yields. We will feel take him out with the seas, roll him on the barren ground, mix blood and water, do not doubt our every need. She will feed what we got her. never wait for Johnny Barleycorn. This is the day that surely he will be reborn. Bring down the blame on Johnny. He shall be the one that will be torn.